This video is brought to you by Ground News. Over the weekend, Russians went to the polls to pick their next president. In an election marred by irregularities, protests and widespread reports of fraud, incumbent President Vladimir Putin claimed victory with 87% of the vote, including in Russia's illegally occupied territories in Ukraine, cementing his grip on power for the foreseeable future. However, while the official result was never really in doubt, analysis of leaked tallies and badly falsified ballots suggests that Putin inflated his popularity by about 20 percentage points, significantly more than usual, and that the most liberal opposition candidate, Vladislav Davankov, also outperformed expectations. So in this video, we're going to look at how the election panned out, the difference between the official results and the actual results, and what this tells us about Russia's politics. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into the results, a bit of context. The first and most obvious thing to stress is that there wasn't any real opposition to Putin on the ballot in this election. As you probably know, Alexei Navalny, long the most prominent opposition politician in Russia, died in a Russian penal colony a few weeks ago. But it's worth mentioning that over the weekend, Putin basically admitted to killing him for the first time, telling state media on Sunday that he tried to negotiate a prisoner swap for Navalny with the West, but his offer was refused, and in Putin's words, then, unfortunately, what happened happened. Similarly, the other significant opposition politician, Boris Nadezhdin, an anti-war candidate who describes the special military operation as a mistake, was banned from running a few months ago. Nadezhdin made quite a stir when he announced his candidacy in November of last year, and within days he'd collected over 200,000 signatures, twice the 100,000 he needed to qualify as a candidate. Originally, it looked like the Kremlin was going to allow Nadezhdin to run, presumably as a means to gauge opposition to the war within Russia. But when Nadezhdin looked like he was becoming too popular, his campaign was shut down. Volunteers collecting signatures on his behalf were beaten up, and he was subsequently barred from running in the election by the Central Election Commission, which claimed to have found irregularities in signatures supporting his candidacy. However, there were three other candidates on the ballot at this election: Nikolai Kharitonov of the Communist Party, Vladislav Davankov of the New People Party, a sort of liberal opposition party founded in 2020, and Leonid Slutsky of the Liberal Democratic Party, a Russian ultra-nationalist party. While none of these three were ever going to win or actually challenge Putin, which is why, unlike Navalny and Nadezhdin, they were allowed to run, the distribution of their vote share is still worth paying attention to, because it tells us something about Russia's electoral geography and Putin's real popularity inside Russia. This is especially true for Kharitonov, because the communists have long been a reliable outlet for expressing controlled discontent towards Putin, especially in Russia's southern regions, and for Davankov, who's sort of become the go-to protest vote for liberal Russians, especially those living abroad. So let's get into the results. Now, obviously, there were sort of two sets of results when it comes to the Russian elections. There were the official results published by the Central Election Commission, which are manipulated by the Kremlin to inflate Putin's popularity. And then there were the actual results, the best approximations of which are calculated by eagle-eyed Russia watchers via a combination of leaks, unofficial exit polls, and corrections of obvious falsifications. The consensus amongst well-versed Russia watchers is that, in the past, there's usually been a 10 to 15 point difference between these two numbers. In other words, Putin, or his preferred candidate, usually wins 60 to 65% of the vote, and then the Kremlin tops him up with another 15%. This takes Putin to between 75 and 80%, which is what he got in 2018. This time, the official results claim that Putin has done better than ever before, winning just over 87% of the vote on a turnout of 74%. Kharitonov came second with 4.6%, Davankov came third with 4.2%, and Slutsky came last with just 3%, with the remaining 1.2% put down to invalid ballots. Now, what's interesting about this result isn't that Putin won, but rather quite how implausibly large his apparent margin of victory is. 87% is significantly more than any previous presidential election, and significantly higher than what pollsters were predicting ahead of the election. Independent pollsters like Levada and Russian Field, for instance, basically said that they expected Putin to do as well as he did in 2018, and even the two big state-owned pollsters, VCIOM and FOM, only put Putin at 75% and 81% respectively. 87% is probably something like 20 percentage points higher than Putin's actual results. Moscow's Danilovsky region is a good proxy for calculating the difference between the official and actual result, because the way results were falsified here is that vote counters basically claim that Putin won 100% of the vote in a handful of polling stations to bring his average up, but apparently didn't change the numbers in most of the other polling stations. In these unrevised ballots, Putin actually won about 67% of the vote, with roughly 18% going to Danakov and 6% or so going to Kharitonov. Given that the Central Election Commission claims that Putin won 87% in Moscow, and Danilovsky is basically your median Moscow district, this implies that the Kremlin inflated Putin's vote share by about 20%. The other interesting thing about Danilovsky's results is Danakov's overperformance. Unofficial exit polls suggest that Danakov also won outright in most polling stations abroad, and while this isn't a total shock, it's nonetheless a pretty poor result for Putin, who used to be actually pretty popular even amongst the Russian diaspora. In general, it looks like Davankov performed best in Russia's northern regions, where, according to official results, he came second behind Putin in several subjects, while Kharitonov and the communists performed best in the southern areas known as Russia's Red Belt. This is the dominant divide in Russia's electoral geography, and it's recurred in basically every election since 1996, with the south tending to be more culturally conservative and pro-communist than the north. All in all, the two interesting things here are Davankov's overperformance, especially in the north and abroad, and the fact that the Kremlin apparently inflated Putin's popularity by more than they usually do. Davankov's newfound popularity suggests that, even though Putin is still popular in Russia, the ideological gap between the Russian liberals and your median Putin supporter is growing wider. On the other hand, that the Kremlin probably inflated Putin's popularity by more than usual might suggest one of two things. It could be that Putin feels more insecure in post than he has done in the past, and has inflated his support as a defensive maneuver to shore up his authority. Alternatively, it could be that the Kremlin are using this election as a mandate for something big, like possibly another mobilization or some sort of escalation against Ukraine or the West. So we'll just have to wait and see. Now, Putin's re-election victory is probably not surprising, and it likely won't change the war in Ukraine. We'll just have to wait and see what happens next. And lucky for you, our sponsor Ground News is your ultimate tool for easily navigating news coverage. Their app and website creates really comprehensive story overviews on any topic, so you can easily compare how news is covered across the world and political spectrum. For every article reporting on a story, you'll see the source's political bias, how factual they are, and even who owns them. For example, check out this story about Putin winning the presidential election in Russia. Not only can I see that there are 162 sources reporting the story, but I can also quickly identify which sources have a political bias according to ratings from independent news monitoring organisations. I can also see that this story is being reported pretty equally on the political spectrum. 38% of the news sources lean left, while 36% lean right. And I can also see how different headlines shape the story, with some also sharing how the silent protests in front of polling stations had no effect. I also especially like their blind spot feed, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum. For example, if you lean right, you might have missed this story about the US House of Representatives voting on a TikTok ban. It's unlike any other news app you've come across, so go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link down in the description to get 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. That's only $5 a month to help an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.